Picture this. It is December of 1944, somewhere in the Ardennes forest along the border of Belgium and Luxembourg. The temperature has dropped to somewhere around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and it is not just cold. It is the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. Snow is falling sideways, driven by a wind that never seems to stop, and thousands of young American men are crouched in shallow holes scraped out of frozen ground, waiting for an enemy they cannot see. This was the reality for so many soldiers during what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, one of the coldest and deadliest winters American troops ever had to endure. And the question that still fascinates historians and curious minds alike is simple. How did they survive it? The truth is, survival in that kind of cold was never guaranteed, and thousands of men did not make it through unscathed. But the ones who did survive relied on a combination of preparation, improvisation, sheer willpower, and a logistical system that, while far from perfect, tried desperately to keep pace with the brutal demands of a winter war nobody had fully planned for. Let's start with the uniform itself, because clothing was the very first line of defense, and honestly, it was often not enough. American soldiers heading into the European winter of 1944 were typically issued a wool uniform, which included a wool shirt, wool trousers, and a wool overcoat. Wool has a real advantage in cold weather because it retains some insulating properties even when wet, unlike cotton, which loses almost all its warmth the moment moisture gets into it. But here's the problem. Many of these uniforms were designed with a temperate European autumn in mind, not the kind of brutal, sustained sub-freezing temperatures that hit the Ardennes that December. The wool coats were heavy, they soaked up water like a sponge during rain or wet snow, and once soaked, they became incredibly heavy and slow to dry, sometimes taking days in field conditions where there was no fire, no shelter, and no time to properly dry out. On top of the standard uniform, soldiers were sometimes issued a field jacket, and later in the war some units received the M1943 field jacket system, which was actually a fairly forward-thinking design for its time. It used a layering concept, something we take for granted today with modern outdoor gear, but which was relatively novel then. The idea was you would wear a wool shirt close to the body, add a wool sweater or liner, then the M43 jacket shell over that, creating pockets of trapped air that your body heat could warm up. The problem was supply. Not every unit received these newer systems in time, and many soldiers fighting in the coldest, most desperate weeks of the Bulge were still wearing older, less effective gear because the supply chain simply could not keep up with the sudden demand created by the German offensive. Boots were arguably an even bigger problem than the coats, and this is something that gets overlooked a lot when people imagine World War II combat. The standard issue combat boot at the time was not waterproof. It was leather, and while leather can be treated to resist some water, it was nowhere near sufficient for standing in snow, mud, and slush for hours or days at a time. This led to one of the most devastating and preventable injuries of the entire war, something called trench foot. Trench foot happens when feet are kept wet and cold for extended periods, cutting off proper circulation, and in severe cases it leads to tissue death, meaning amputation. During the Battle of the Bulge alone, tens of thousands of American soldiers were pulled off the front lines because of trench foot and frostbite, not because of enemy fire. Some estimates suggest cold weather injuries accounted for nearly as many casualties as combat wounds did during certain periods of that campaign, which tells you just how serious this threat really was. So what did soldiers do about it? A lot of it came down to discipline and improvisation at the individual level. Soldiers were instructed, when possible, to change their socks regularly, sometimes carrying a spare pair tucked inside their jacket or shirt, close to their body, so that body heat would help dry the socks out while they marched or waited. This might sound like a small detail, but it made a genuine difference. A soldier who kept dry feet even for a few extra hours each day dramatically reduced his risk of losing toes or an entire foot to frostbite. Officers who understood this would enforce sock changes almost like a religious ritual because they had seen firsthand what happened to units that neglected it. Beyond socks, soldiers used whatever materials they could scavenge to insulate their boots and bodies. Newspaper, when available, was stuffed into boots for extra insulation. Straw, when soldiers could find it in barns or abandoned buildings, was used to line foxholes, providing a barrier between the frozen ground and their bodies. This was hugely important because the ground itself acted like a heat sink, constantly pulling warmth out of anyone lying or sitting directly on it. A foxhole lined with straw, branches, or even discarded ammunition crates was significantly warmer than bare frozen earth. Speaking of foxholes, digging them in that kind of winter was its own brutal challenge. The ground was frozen solid, sometimes down to a foot or more in depth, and soldiers had to hack through it with entrenching tools which were small folding shovels barely adequate for the task. Some men resorted to using small explosive charges just to break up the frozen soil enough to start digging. Once a foxhole was dug, soldiers would often cover the top partially with logs, branches, or a poncho, both for protection from shrapnel and to trap a small amount of body heat inside the shelter. Multiple soldiers would frequently huddle together in a single foxhole, not just for camaraderie, but because shared body heat was a genuine survival tool. 2 or 3 men pressed together in a confined space could raise the internal temperature of that little pocket of air by several degrees, which in survival terms could be the difference between manageable discomfort and dangerous hypothermia. Sleep itself became a tactical decision. Soldiers could not simply lie down and rest the way they might in warmer conditions, because falling asleep in extreme cold without adequate insulation could mean never waking up. Many units instituted a rotation system where soldiers would take turns sleeping for short periods while others stayed awake, partly for security reasons given the German offensive, but also because someone needed to keep an eye on their sleeping comrades to make sure none of them were slipping into a dangerous state of hypothermic unconsciousness. Sentries would sometimes physically check on sleeping men, shaking them awake periodically just to confirm they were still responsive. Food and hot drinks played a critical role too, though getting hot food to frontline troops during the Bulge was an enormous logistical challenge. Army field kitchens tried to prepare hot meals when possible, but the chaotic nature of the German offensive meant supply lines were frequently cut, delayed, or under direct attack. When hot food could not reach the front, soldiers relied on C rations and K rations, which were canned or packaged foods designed for portability rather than nutrition or morale. Soldiers would sometimes warm these rations by placing the cans near small fires when it was safe to do so, though often the risk of revealing their position to the enemy meant fires had to be kept small, brief, or avoided entirely. Coffee became almost a form of currency and comfort combined. Soldiers treasured hot coffee not just for the caffeine, but for the simple physical warmth of holding a hot cup and drinking something warm when everything else around them was freezing. Alcohol also played a role, though not in the way people might assume from movies. There is a persistent myth that alcohol warms you up in cold weather, but physiologically it actually does the opposite in dangerous ways. Alcohol causes blood vessels near the skin to dilate, which creates a temporary feeling of warmth while actually accelerating heat loss from the body's core. Some soldiers who drank heavily in extreme cold conditions, believing it would help them stay warm, actually increased their risk of hypothermia. Military medical officers at the time were aware of this danger and tried to discourage drinking specifically for warmth, even though alcohol was sometimes issued or available informally among troops for morale purposes. Movement itself was another survival tool that soldiers learned to use deliberately. Standing or sitting still for long periods in freezing temperatures is far more dangerous than staying active, because muscle movement generates heat. Soldiers were often taught or simply learned through hard experience to flex their toes inside their boots, clench and unclench their fists, and shift their body weight periodically, even while trying to stay still and quiet during watch duty. Small, subtle movements like this could help maintain circulation to extremities without giving away a position to enemy observers. The psychological toll of that winter cannot be overstated either. Soldiers were not just fighting frostbite and hypothermia, they were also fighting exhaustion, fear, and the disorientation of a surprise German offensive that had caught Allied forces off guard. Many units found themselves surrounded or cut off from supply lines entirely for days at a time, which meant improvisation was not optional, it was mandatory for survival. Soldiers in surrounded positions like the town of Bastogne had to ration not just ammunition and food, but literally everything, including basic winter supplies like blankets and extra clothing, because resupply by air was often the only option, and weather conditions frequently grounded aircraft that would have dropped much-needed supplies. When supplies did get through, whether by airdrop or by supply trucks that managed to break through, soldiers received items like wool blankets, extra socks, and sometimes sleeping bags, though sleeping bags were in short supply and often reserved for soldiers in the most exposed or forward positions. A wool blanket properly used could be wrapped around the body in layers combined with a poncho on the outside to block wind and moisture, creating a crude but sometimes effective barrier against the elements. Medical treatment for cold weather injuries during this period was fairly rudimentary by modern standards, but medics did what they could with the resources available. Soldiers showing early signs of frostbite such as numbness or a whitish discoloration of the skin, particularly on fingers, toes, ears, and noses, were instructed to gradually rewarm the affected area, never with direct intense heat like an open flame, because rapid rewarming could cause additional tissue damage. Instead, medics would encourage gentle rewarming using body heat, tucking an affected hand into an armpit, for example, or wrapping affected feet in dry cloth and gradually warming them near but not directly on a heat source. Officers and unit commanders also played a role in survival that often gets overlooked in favor of more dramatic combat narratives. Effective leaders understood that maintaining morale and enforcing basic cold weather discipline like sock changes, foxhole insulation, and rotation of sentry duty could dramatically reduce casualty rates within their units. Units with strong leadership and clear cold weather protocols consistently reported fewer cases of frostbite and trench foot compared to units where such discipline broke down under the stress and chaos of combat. There's also the matter of sheer adaptability and the resourcefulness that so many American soldiers displayed during that brutal winter. Soldiers scavenged materials from destroyed vehicles, abandoned buildings, and even fallen enemy soldiers when necessary, taking German winter gear when it was available because in many cases German forces had better cold weather equipment prepared for the Eastern Front conditions they had previously fought in. It was not uncommon for American soldiers to be found wearing a mixture of their own uniform pieces combined with captured German coats, gloves, or boots, simply because survival took priority over uniform regulations in those desperate weeks. Communication and coordination between units also improved as the battle wore on. As commanders began to recognize patterns in where cold weather casualties were occurring most severely, and adjusted rotation schedules to pull soldiers back from the most exposed forward positions more frequently, giving them brief opportunities to warm up, dry out, and recover before returning to the line. This rotation system, while imperfect and often disrupted by the ongoing German offensive, represented a growing institutional understanding that cold weather itself was as much an enemy as the opposing army. By the time the Battle of the Bulge concluded in late January of 1945, with Allied forces having pushed back the German offensive, the cost in terms of cold weather casualties alone was staggering. Historians estimate that among American forces, cold-related injuries, primarily frostbite and trench foot, numbered in the tens of thousands, a figure that rivaled or in some assessments exceeded the number of combat wounds sustained during the same period. This grim statistic underscores just how significant a role winter conditions played in shaping the human cost of that campaign. In the aftermath, the United States military took the lessons learned from the Ardennes winter seriously, leading to improvements in cold weather gear design, better logistical planning for winter campaigns, and more standardized training on cold weather survival techniques for future conflicts. Many of the practices developed and refined out of hard necessity during that winter, things like layering systems, moisture management, foxhole insulation techniques, and rotation schedules to prevent prolonged exposure, would go on to influence military cold weather doctrine for decades that followed, including practices used in later conflicts fought in equally harsh winter environments. Looking back, the survival of American soldiers during that brutal winter was never the result of any single miracle solution or piece of equipment. It was a combination of imperfect gear supplemented by constant improvisation, leadership that enforced basic but critical discipline, camaraderie that translated into literal shared body warmth, and an incredible amount of individual resilience and willpower under conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. These were young men, many barely out of their teens, facing not only an enemy army but an environment that was actively trying to kill them through cold alone. The fact that so many of them survived, adapted, and ultimately helped turn back one of the last major German offensives of the wars speaks to a kind of quiet heroism that often gets overshadowed by the more dramatic combat narratives we typically associate with World War II. It was not just about firing weapons or storming positions. Sometimes survival itself, simply making it through another freezing night, was the victory that mattered most.